Olá, boa tarde. Sejam todos bem-vindos ao seminário do ciclo de debates do Instituto de Economia da UFRJ. Eu sou a professora Ana Carolina. Hoje nós recebemos Mathilde Bouvier. Ela é aluna de doutorado da Université Paris-Dauphine e ela faz uma visita nesse momento aqui ao Instituto de Economia. Ela vai apresentar um artigo que já é da sua tese de doutorado, Crises and Women's Labor Market Dynamics in Brazil. Ela vai fazer a apresentação em 40 a 50 minutos, em inglês, e depois a gente vai ter uma sessão de perguntas e respostas. Eu vou me desculpar com vocês que hoje eu não vou poder ficar aqui no seminário, mas Valéria vai assumir depois, tá bom? A lista de presença também já está circulando e eu peço que vocês, ao final, entreguem para a professora Valéria. Bom seminário a todos, Mathilde. Muito obrigada. Seja bem-vinda.
Obrigada a você. Thank you very much for being here. So, as it was said in the introduction, I'm going to present a chapter of my thesis. So it is still work in progress, but so any feedback will be really welcome. So the paper is entitled Crisis and Women's Labor Market Dynamics in Brazil. And this is a quite descriptive paper. And the research question is how do recent recessions affected men and women on the labor market in Brazil and why they have been affected differently. And so this is a descriptive and empirical approach. Consists in a first part, which is a really graphical analysis, putting in perspective important labor market rates or labor market flows and crisis periods, of course by gender. And then there is a second part that is more econometric and focus on transitions on the labor markets in times of crisis for a shorter period due to data availability. So first, just some intuition on why women and men could be affected differently in times of crisis. The literature has emphasized some macroeconomic mechanism. That is, so a lot of the literature focus on the US and some European countries, but they identified that there are gender gaps in job loss in times of crisis due to the structure of employment, with men more concentrated in tradable sectors, that is manufacturing or like constructions and things like that, whereas women are more concentrated in non-tradable sectors like services, public services that are less destroyed in times of crisis. So this literature shows that women's employment is less cyclical, like it reduces less in times of crisis than men's, but it also reduces with transition to out of employment, but less strongly than men. And in the case of Brazil, it's interesting to extend this question because the gendered segregation of employment is a little less strong than in the US, for example. There are more women in manufacturing, or there is a lot of but it's still different with women focusing more in public services and so on, but just to a lesser degree. If you want to talk about this later, I have some figures here, but I'm going to focus more on the mechanism here. And also, it's important to extend this analysis to context with a high informality labor market, with a very specific role of informality in times of crisis that would allow people who have no access to unemployment benefits, for example, to maybe go to informal form of employment and then stay employed, but in a different type. And also, the literature has emphasized some micro mechanism. So it would be more intra-household insurance labor supply. So households, the literature suggested that households may share risk through marriage. So the literature has emphasized an added worker effect where when the husband loses his job, the wife is entering the labor force or employment in order to compensate for the loss of income. And so this has been shown in older crises, and in more recent crises, this mechanism is less obvious. However, the literature highlights that there is still some precautionary labor supply from wives, but a slightly different mechanism because already employed wives would remain employed when the husbands face a higher risk of losing their job rather than actually losing the job. So we will see later that this reduction in the exit flows may explain some reduction of the gender gap in the labor market in times of crisis. And so this is interesting to extend this more also to the case of Brazil, because the social protection may be weaker, for example, for the people who are working in informal form of job arrangements. And by definition, they have a low social protection, and so this family-based mechanism could be even stronger. And there are some papers about this in cases like Brazil, but it's a bit more focusing on the added worker effect and on households that are directly hit by the shock. And here we are more broader, like just focusing on people that are facing a risk of job loss in general, rather than actual job loss. And so also the literature highlighted, of course, very different dynamics during the COVID-19 crisis, because in this case, women's employment has been more affected in every country in the world. And they faced larger decline in their employment to population rates. And so this is also due to macroeconomic structural reasons that the high contact and not very flexible jobs have been more affected. So, for example, in the case of the US, it explains 1/3 of the stronger decline of women employment, but also because there were, health shock and shock on the need for care work by families, and this care work has been performed by women first, and this explains most of the decline in the case of the US, for example. So these are some theoretical elements to understand what we are doing in this paper. Yes. And so for the context, the crisis in Brazil, so to determine what are crises, we are based on the work by FGV, who have a group that is dating the quarters that are crisis or not. And so we are going to rely on that with the shaded areas that are a period of crisis. And so they use very objective measures like drop of GDP, but also their own knowledge of the Brazilian economy. So we are just relying on this to classify which quarters are crisis or not. Yeah. And so to start with the graphical analysis, so we use the data from the PNAD. So the cross-section PNAD for the first period until 2015, and then we use the PNAD continua to investigate transitions on the labor market, because we can observe households up to 5 times consecutively, and so we can follow them and see if there are changing states on the labor market across time. Yeah. And so the first graph is simply the employment to population rate. And so this is the share of the employed population on the total working age population. So for the moment, as defined by the IBGE, it means like people above 14. And then so we compute gender-specific rates, one rate for men, one rate for women. And then we compute the gender gap. So this is the difference between male and women employment rates on normalized by the employment to population rate of men. And so maybe it's a bit small, but what we observe on these two graphs is that so the trend is increasing for women, whereas it is always decreasing for men. And so the shaded area are the periods of crisis. And one can notice that during crisis for women, in other crises, the employment to population rate is actually increasing over the period of crisis. It's also increasing in other periods, but during crisis, it has been increasing. But there is, so if there is some gaps, it's because there is no data this year because of census years. The last crisis, 2014-2016, is a bit different because the employment rate of women has been decreasing too, but much less than the one of men. It has been decreasing by 3 percentage points for women compared to 6 for men. And so for men, we see that each time during crisis, the employment to population rate is decreasing. So it's different dynamics. And last thing I wanted to show for this, two last things. It's recovering here for female during this period, but for male, it's really it's recovering very slowly, and it's not at all at the same level than before the crisis. And then during the COVID-19, the reduction has been a bit stronger in percentage point for women, but like relative to the 45 baseline rate in percent, this decline is much stronger than for women than for men. And then it recovered quite quickly to the pre-crisis level, and then it goes up and start to reach again the level before the 2014 crisis. And what I wanted to say on more on that is that so we use the official datation of economic crisis quarters by the group from FGV, but in the further version, we would like to consider more the health crisis rather than the economic crisis of COVID-19, because here it's only 2 quarters, beginning of 2020, whereas the health crisis was longer. But yeah, for this version, we have this measure, but it will be evolving. And so the gender gap is, it doesn't work. You can imagine that if it's increasing for women and decreasing for men, the gender gap is decreasing in this period. I don't know why the button is not working. And so this flow was, this rate is a stock that is shaped by 2 flows that is interesting to investigate in order to understand the mechanism behind why it is increasing or decreasing. So the employment rate at T+1 is just the employment rate at T plus the entry in employment and minus the exit of employment. So we are going to look at these flows for the 2 most recent downturns to investigate the dynamics behind the period of crisis and the evolution of the rate in times of crisis. And so, of course, these rates, they are shaped by structural forces like increasing education, changing demographics or institutions, but also by cyclical conditions, because in time of crisis, there are a lot of job destruction with people going from employment to non-employment, and a reduction in access to employment with less people managing to find a job in times of crisis. So we are going to look at these transition rates also graphically in the next slides. And yeah, so this is the two rates I just presented. So here you have the employment to non-employment rates. So this is job destruction, and here the non-employment to employment, so the freeze in hiring. And so in this graph, we see a little from which side comes the difference between men and women, because so in green here above you have the rate for women, and below you have the rate for men, and it's opposite. Like we have less men exiting employment than women, and here we have more men finding a job than women initially. And so the period of crisis is dashed here. And what we can see is that for women, when the downturn started, the number of exits is decreasing, going from around 30 to around 11 percentage points. So 2 percentage points out of transition of like 12% initially is important in proportion. Because so this means that, for example, in this quarter in 2012, 12% of women that were in employment were going out of employment. And it goes down with the beginning of the crisis. So less women are exiting employment. And then at some point when the crisis starts to be very strong for everyone, it increases again for women. They manage less to stay in their job, but it's quickly recovered to the around the pre-crisis level. It's quite steady, and in this period that we saw that it was not very good for the labor market, they are also decreasing their transition out of employment. Whereas for men, it's increasing during the crisis. So before the crisis, around 8% of employed men were going out of employment, and it reaches 10% at the end of the crisis, and stayed recover slowly to 8% at the end. And so during the COVID-19 crisis, it increased a lot for both, and then there is an important drop because people who managed to remain employed were not moving from their position and securing that position, because this period was very complicated, and then after the COVID-19, it recovers to normal levels. But so what we see here in red is the gap, the gender gap, of this kind of transitions. And so for during the crisis, so before the crisis, women, this flow from employment to non-employment was 70% higher for women. And then along the crisis, it drops to 35% of the flow. So this is an important drop. And then after this crisis, the gap remains stabilized. During COVID, the gap increased again, meaning that men, like women, were exiting more again. And then with back to the recovery, it started to return to like 50%. And whereas for the hiring process, like non-employed that manage to access employment, we see that it's around 20% for women and 12% for men. And in both cases, it's decreasing in times of crisis. And so the gender gap is quite stable. both gender have trouble to find a job in this period. And so for the COVID period, it's also important reduction in the access to employment, and then it recovers quite 2 years after, it recovers back to the pre-crisis level. But so the mechanisms, it's just descriptive evidence that it's more that women in employment manage to, they are exiting less than in normal time, and maybe for this intra-household insurance labor supply. And it's not really coming from women managing to access more to employment. This would be more the added worker effect, and this is more the like increased labor market attachment of married wives in times of crisis. So just last descriptive figure on the dynamics to show the difference between men and women, and then we will turn more on the mechanism again. But it's just a regression that is estimated separately for both crises, the 2014 and the COVID-19 crisis. And just the outcome is a dummy for people being employed or not. And then we just look at the effect of each quarter for each gender and comparing the variation, like the crisis effect for both gender of each quarter compared to the last quarter before the crisis. And so this coefficient measures the effect of the crisis on the gender gap, because it is the specific effect of the crisis on women. And so if this coefficient is negative, it means that the crisis affects less women. And so this coefficient is the effect of the crisis on male, and the sum of these two is the effect of the crisis on women. And so we are going to plot this coefficient and the sum of this coefficient to see just the effect of the two crises on employment for both gender, and then we will turn to the transition analysis. So the results suggest that it's quite consistent with the previous graph. Also, these regressions are controlling for like location, age, education, like ethnicity, and so on. And so we see that the male employment was the first to be affected. And then when the crisis was very strong, it also decreased for female. But for female, so they were also affected by the crisis, but then in a it's here is 2 percentage points less. So for women, it's a plateau. It's a plateau after around 2 percentage points before the pre-crisis level. Each coefficient is compared to the last quarter before the crisis, and for male, it really continues to go deeper. And also after, you see that even after the crisis, the rate is not going back to the pre-crisis level. And for the crisis, the COVID-19 level, it's also compared to the last quarter before the COVID-19 crisis. And so both gender were really affected by the shock. But then it started to recover as of at the end of 2020 for men, whereas for women it remains more complicated to get back to employment, and also after they recover more quickly than women, because you have to see first the green, and so the blue ones are going up faster than for women, and after it recovers back to the pre-COVID-19 crisis level, and even higher after. So after COVID-19, the labor market seems to finally recover, but like this level here is not even the level of this here before the first crisis. So I'm going to turn to the more like mechanism investigation. And for this, we are going to rely on transition analysis, and more, we are going to disaggregate more the labor market status than we did so far. And also the group across the population to investigate the specific role of married women in this context. So we have 4 groups, the married women, married men, single women, and single men. And we are going to compare their transitions between different labor market status. So we are going to define 6 labor market status. The first one is a formal employee, so you have your working card. And so this is 32% of the population. This is the population between 18 and 70, just to bound a little more. And so this is an important state for women, 28%, and also for men even more, it's 38% of men who are formal employees. Then we have the informal employees, who are also important labor market status, as 13% of people are in this states, and so 13% of women and almost 13% of male too. Then we have formal independence, which is a little less, for example, for women it's 4% and it's 9% of male who are in this situation of formal independence. And we included this because over the period of study, the platform economy is a very important change in the labor market that we are willing to consider here. And we have also the informal independent status, which is more important for men than women, with 16% for men versus 7% of women who are in this status. And so why we differentiate between these labor market states is because they probably do not react to economic crisis in the same way. For example, a formal employee may be the most protected group in times of crisis compared to informal employees that are maybe people more easier for employers to lay off in times of crisis, the most flexible workers. And formal independent and informal independence could be categories that actually grows in time of crisis because it allows laid-off workers or new entrants on the labor market to join this category because other categories are more complicated to access. So, like to create an account to do like platform work or independent work, in times of crisis. And finally, we have the unemployed and the out of labor force people. So the unemployed are people who are jobless, who are looking for a job and available to work. And in this unemployment status, we also add the one classified as discouraged job seeker by the ILO and IBGE, meaning that people who are available, who want to work and who are jobless, but they gave up looking for a job because of labor demand reason, meaning that they feel that there is no job for them in their locality. So they are more in the unemployed, and the out of labor force are the people who are not looking for a job, jobless and not looking for a job, either because they don't want or because they are studying or because they have to do too much work at home and have no more time to also go on the labor market. And so this is an important labor market situation for women, with 38% of women in this situation on the labor market and 15% of men. Yes, so we have quite a big sample because we are in like panel, we construct the panel and then we do repeated cross-section to see the evolution in times of crisis. And so this is what I explained about informal employment and the role of independent work. And as women are mainly concentrated in the employees' status and out of labor force and employment, we are going to focus on these transitions because they are like the most important states for women on the labor market, and otherwise it's a lot of transitions to investigate if we add everything. But if you have questions on specific ones, I have them in the appendix of the slides. And so it's just the regression that we use to investigate the differential effect between our groups is just interaction to have a heterogeneity analysis. So this is the dependent variable is a transition between some states. For example, if people are initially formally unemployed and go to unemployment, and the independent variable would be, so there is a set of controls that I will explain a little more after. Yes, so we are going just to sum the coefficient to retrieve the effect of the crisis for each group. So for example, this beta 3 would be the effect of the crisis for single men. If you want the effect of the crisis for single women, you add the beta 3 with female times crisis, and it gives you the effect of the crisis for single women. And for married men, it's a single man plus married times crisis, and so on. And so you can recover the effect of the crisis for each group. So we are going to see how the crisis is affecting the transitions on the labor market for each of these groups. Yeah. And so for the control variable, we add some structural controls, and also what we are interested in is to assess whether the difference in transitions between men and women are coming from sectors and occupation segregation. So we are going to run the regression 1 with no sector and occupation controls. And then we do it a second time, including sectors and occupation fixed effects. So in the first regression, it's just like comparing men and women and their subgroup of married single. And with the crisis fixed effect, we compare within the same sector how is going to evolve the coefficient of married men and women, for example, knowing that they are in the same sector, so in the same exposure to the crisis. Like, for example, if men are more affected because they are in the construction sector, we will see it in the regression to the males coefficients, whereas in the second, we are comparing married women and married men within the construction sector. So if the construction sector is the most affected by the crisis and men are losing jobs because of that, it will be captured by the fixed effect, and we are really comparing the groups within the same sector and occupation. So it will yield coefficients net of the job composition, and if the sector selection fully explains the differences, then the differences will be 0 in the second regression. Yeah. Okay, I will rush up. So we are going to focus on the transition out of formal employee status and then out of informal employee. I'm going to focus first on the 2014-16 period and then have a word on the COVID-19 period. But for this second crisis, we need to work more because there are very specific dynamics, and so this comparative approach needs to be a bit more explored. But what we see here So you have a transition from formal, so it's people who are formally formal employees at baseline. And we have here the pre-crisis transition level by group. So, for example, it's here transition to informal employee, to unemployment, and to out of employment. And like we see, for example, that married men have the lowest transition rate before the crisis, like to informal employment and even to other labor market status. They are the ones that remain the most in the formal employee states. And we see that this is a crisis effect for each group. And we see that the transition from formal employment to informal employment is not different from zero for each group, except for married women. It's reducing by 0.5 percentage points, and the baseline level is 5.5, so it's like 10% reduction. And actually, informal employee states is a way to get more flexibility in your job. And so, in times of crisis, married women only are less transiting to this labor market arrangement. So they turn less to more flexible form of employment. And what we see here, and we see that it's in the second column, we see that it's a transition from formal employee to unemployment. So people that lose their job and are directly willing to find one after. And we see that it is increasing for all groups. So both married and single men and women are losing more their job in times of crisis, but the coefficient is stronger for males because it's around 0.6 for males and 0.3 for women. So there is a significant difference of 0.3 percentage points between married women and married men. But once we control for the sector and occupation, this difference for sectors of occupation, the difference is disappearing, meaning that the job destruction is partly due to the fact that women are working more in sectors that are less affected by the crisis. And the last point here is that if we look at transition from formal employment to out of employment, it's not different from zero for males, whether married or single. However, for married women, it's decreasing, and especially strongly for married women. And for single women, it's decreasing also, but it depends on a bit on which women we include in this group of single women. So we need to work a bit more on this. This is a very broad definition, so it includes, for example, the daughters and so on, and there could be also an intra-household insurance mechanism, but the stronger effect is for married women. And so the difference between married men and women is 0.6, and the coefficient is not changing once we include the occupation and industry fixed effect, meaning that it has nothing specifically to do with the sectoral composition initially. So it's really maybe this intra-household insurance mechanism of women exiting less the labor market in times of crisis. And just to compare with the informal employees, people initially in informal employment, so the rates are much more higher than people initially in formal employees. Informal employees are moving much more like to formal employment, to unemployment, or to out of employment. And so what we see here is that for all groups, there is a reduction in transition from informal employee to formal employee because this labor market state is more difficult to access in times of crisis. All these groups have increased in their transition to unemployment. and the coefficients are higher than the formal employee, meaning that the informal employees are more exposed in times of crisis. They are more likely to lose their job. And also we have kind of the same pattern with very, like it's between married men and married women, the difference is 1.40, which is very significant. And once we include the control and industry, the control for industry and occupation, the coefficient is much smaller and much less significant, meaning again that in the transition in employment to unemployment are explained by the sectoral composition. And here again, we find this mechanism of employed women that are exiting less the labor market in times of crisis, with a significant reduction only for married women in times of crisis. And yeah, once we add the control, it doesn't change anything to the variation in this gap. Yeah. And so for the COVID-19 crisis, it needs to be more investigated in the future version, especially with the heterogeneity regarding the presence of young children. But for the moment, what we can see is that the transition to unemployment and to out of employment are a bit stronger for women than for men. And yeah, whether to unemployment or to out of employment, but even these categories deserve to be a bit refined with the COVID-19 crisis. Yeah, and yeah, same for the COVID-19 crisis for informal employees. They were more affected than formal employees, with a higher transition to out of employment. But as we said, this is there is economic crisis quarters that where when everybody stayed at home and had some emergency help by the government. So we need to investigate more this crisis in the context of public policy and specific childcare needs of this period. And just a word about the labor force transition, the transition out of labor force. We see that it's decreasing the out of labor force to formal employee or to even informal employee are decreasing for all groups, with no specific effect for married women versus married men, and same no specific difference between groups in transition to out of employment, meaning that for this crisis the added worker effect is no longer the main mechanism, but probably it was more important in the previous crisis. And so to conclude, so the economic crises are a very important period, I think, to study the gender inequalities on the labor market, and because they are very different across Deutschland, partly due to increase in employment transition that are smaller for women, mainly due to the sectoral composition of employment. But also there is a mechanism of married women who reduce their exit and transition to less flexible job in case of formal employee women. And this is quite consistent with the precautionary labor supply response. However, it's important to consider because even it's important to consider what it implies for these women to remain in their labor market status, because it could have important policy implication. And for the COVID-19 crisis, the paper deserves a broader investigation for the moment, but we can see that there are very different dynamics with this insurance role of married women not occurring, And so it's ongoing work, and we are going to investigate this more in the next version. So thank you very much for your listening.
It's very interesting. Congratulations for your presentation. And I will open the discussion. Just a comment from this descriptive analysis. I have a question on the fact that the employment rate decreases for both, and then in the first crisis, and then recover more for women than for men.
Yes.
And what is the explanation? Maybe the heterogeneity, more lower jobs for women than men. And another thing, what's the relationship with the participation, the woman participation, with these results? Because women change more the participation rate in the labor market than men. How does this affect these results? Okay, I have this question for the descriptive analysis, and I want to ask you more the difference out of the result of the regressions, out of the formal employment. If you can explain quickly or in summary the difference between single and married women for us to understand better the difference between these groups with the crisis. But thank you. It's very, very interesting your analysis, and I'm really open for the audience if you have some questions.
I would like to know, hello, nice to meet you. I would like to know, you mentioned that coping strategy between couples would be very important in Brazil because we are a developing country and all of that. I would like to know about results that exist in other countries because I've never heard of that kind of strategy. It's a very interesting mechanism. Are there results similar to that in other countries or developed countries, and how they compare to Brazil?
Hi, Mathilde. Thank you for your presentation. I was also wondering on more the international context, if there's any comparison between center countries like France, for example, or Europe, and global south countries, if you see any difference between the relationship of labor between those two realities. Thank you.
More questions? Mathilde, please.
Yes. So for the employment rate of the evolution after the after the 2014 crisis, yes, that it's increasing much more for women than for men. It is also something that I would like to dig more because the post-crisis period I think would be interesting to investigate. Yes, I'm wondering if it's because of this sectoral composition that is more favorable for women, and especially I think that on this period, but I'm not sure, like the public services sector is increasing a little, but I'm not super sure about that. Or if it's maybe, again, the added worker effect that would happen after the crisis when it's easier to access employment. So I've been thinking about it, but for the moment I don't have a clear answer because it's actually something I would like to consider for the next version, and it comforts me that you said it would be interesting to look at this. But in the literature they also say that usually, and it's even more interesting, but because in the literature, in a paper I read on France, they said that the crisis is affecting less women, but actually the period after crisis is hurting more women because they implement like austerity policies that reduce employment in the public sector and so on, and so affect more women. So as it's the contrary here, I think I want to investigate this more, but so for the moment I cannot exactly say why it's increasing more for women after. I don't know if someone has some hints on this, but for sure in the next version I will include the post-crisis period to see, for example, if it's because due to sectoral composition, or if it's added worker effect again or something like this. So sorry that I cannot say directly, but it's super true. And for the second question, I'm not sure I got.
It's the relationship with labor market participation for men and women that's very different, and if maybe it can have an impact on this employment rate. I don't know if you have made some analysis on this kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. That outside of crisis periods?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I should add this kind of analysis. What I have for the moment, for the pre-crisis period, is for example, this that shows that the rate is not the variation in the rate is not so different in the quarters before the crisis. And also what I have is just the pre-crisis transition level. And this show indeed important differences. Because, for example, it's not exactly this rate, but informal employee to formal employee is here 25% for married men, whereas it is 16% of married women that do such transition. So indeed there are very different dynamics even before that. So should be more investigated.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will look at this more. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
And for the single married women, indeed, I need to discuss with the advisor more, because for this group I had to do the trade-off of what to include in the single women group, and either should it be only the heads of the households, or also by, for example, daughters who are living in the households. And so the good news is that it doesn't change so much the result whether I consider only households head and spouse, or if I consider all the people in the households that are between 18 and more. It doesn't change so much the result. Maybe it changes that this is not different from zero, whereas when it's only the heads, and here it's everybody, so it means that the single mothers, the daughters, people who lives with her sister and so on, they are all in this group now. So it's very heterogeneous. But if I consider only household heads, the main difference is that this coefficient is zero, otherwise it's quite similar results. So, but maybe it means that other women, like daughters and so on, also have this intra-household insurance. And I don't know what would be the most relevant way to measure single women. I know in the Brazilian literature it's more household heads and spouses, no? Yeah, right. Yeah. And so I think it would be more relevant, and probably it would be one of the evolution. Yeah. What do you think? Yeah.
Maybe we can have with children, without children, and another types of family to understand better what's going on in this kind of results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. an appendix or another table to avoid too big. Yeah, I think especially for the COVID-19 crisis, I think we have to do this anyway because and also for the I think we will do that. And for the results in other countries, most of the papers I've seen on this topic or this specific why increase in labor market attachment was more focused on the US, but and it was kind of the same. No specific ID worker effect, but this effect of married women that reduce transition out of labor force, and same also affected in transition to unemployment, and also this informal employee, formal employee. They don't have this difference, but they show that for more precarious households, this effect is stronger as it is here. So the results are really similar. And in France, I didn't see a paper for the moment on that. There is a paper that has some comparative analysis during the COVID-19 crisis between different countries that I can find, and they show some differences between countries. So investigating different contexts is interesting. But for classic crisis, I just found on the US for this specific mechanism, and it is very close. Maybe a lesser magnitude of the coefficients. The coefficients are stronger in this context. I don't know if I answered or to both questions.
Any question? No? Thank you very much, Mathilde, for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.